circumstances and fears, you're welcome here. Yes, you're welcome here. Yes, you're welcome here.
Good afternoon. I'm Reverend Dave Thompson, and I'm excited to bring you back to our Civil Human Bible Study. There's our video. It's such a pleasure to have you back. Again, I'm Reverend Dave Thompson, and I'm really excited to have you here today. This is our Civil Human Bible Study, and I'm a civil human minister. And what that means is that I focus my ministry on building human peace and common ground. So in that effort, I'm looking at my own spiritual heritage to try to find those teachings that I feel are applicable to across the board to all humans, regardless of our faith or different politics or different lifestyles. Let's go ahead and jump into the passage. We're in our End Times series today in part 2, where Jesus in this account is talking about what the end times are going to look like, what it's going to look like when he comes back, as he says he's going to in this account, and what should be expected. So let's go ahead and jump into that. It's Matthew chapter 24, verses 9 through 14. And starting in verse 9. Let me just get that there. Okay. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will arise and deceive many. And because lawlessness abounds, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved, and the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. So this section of our conversation around Jesus and his teachings is really one that is very difficult to interpret, often because in our modern age, we have wrapped a lot of popular mythology and sort of storytelling around what these words say. And so it can be difficult, especially for those of us who come from a particular background in Christianity. I came from evangelical Pentecostalism. And the end times was something that was celebrated and was talked about and was used as in many ways, as a source to kind of scare you into participating in Christianity as if God's going to come back as a thief in the night to take us. And there's a sort of panic about when the end times is going to happen. And we had this movie called A Distant Thunder, which is kind of about that. It's kind of hilarious watching it now because it's a 70s version of the interpretation of Jesus's words here. But I want to walk through them and talk about what it means to us here 2,000 years removed, especially those of us who may not be coming from a Christian persuasion, may come from either an atheist or agnostic persuasion. I believe that there are some things that are good points and things that we can use today, right here and now, just as human beings. So let's walk through the passage and talk about what's being said here and how it would have been interpreted by the audience originally reading this in the first century. So the first thing that Jesus says is that you will be delivered into tribulation. What's he talking about? Yesterday we talked about the first part of the end times, that there's going to be people claiming to be the king and Christ, and that there was going to be people misled. And now he's getting to the point where he's talking about what it's actually going to look towards the end. He starts by talking about the fact that it's going to be difficult. There's going to be a tribulation. The word here for tribulation really means to make narrow. It's this idea of when going through a passageway that there's pressure placed upon us so that it's difficult to get through to where we need to go. So that's the kind of the concept that's being communicated here. And then he says, you're going to be killed. And it literally, the language here means put to death. You're going to be hated because of my name. And I want to talk about what that means. What does it mean to be hated by the name of Jesus? Because I come from a very Hellenist Pentecostal background, and the name of Jesus was sort of thrown around as this kind of banner or flag that we would wave that, designated us as good people somehow, that the actual name, the word, or the actual phrase Jesus Christ or Jesus, that there was something, I guess, magical about that. That when you said the name Jesus, that it meant that you were talking on behalf of him. And this phrase here, Jesus says, in the name of Jesus, people are going to hate you because of my name. It doesn't mean what we interpret it to mean today. This is really not a great translation in this particular translation of the scriptures, because it meant a whole lot more to the audience back then. Because when that onoma, the word for name was said, it meant really the all-encompassing aspects of that person. So it's not just the name, it's not just the word Jesus. It is the teachings of, it is the belief structures, it's the way that he acted, that basic representation of who he is. So what he's really saying here is that you are going to be killed and hated because of what I stand for. And what is that? As we've seen, Jesus stood for the poor. Jesus stood for the suffering. Jesus stood for compassion, for humility, for long-suffering, for peacemaking. All of these things are frustrating to those who don't want to follow the law. And that's going to be the big takeaway from this whole conversation today, is going to be what happens when lawless people rule. And what does it look like for those who are trying to live out these good virtues in life and to be good human beings? What does it look like for those of us who are living underneath the rule of somebody or people who refuse to follow any law but their own? That is the real takeaway here. And I'm looking forward to wrapping it up today on that conversation, because I think it's really applicable. I do want to point out here, a lot of people in the church have a different way of taking or interpreting this passage. So as we read it here, and as we look at history, remember how I talked about in the previous study that Jerusalem was going to be attacked by the Romans in 70 CE or AD, basically 70 years after this account? That's exactly what happened. And so Matthew, who's writing this particular account, he's actually referring to this historical event that actually took place, that Jesus was saying, you're going to be killed because the early people who actually didn't see themselves as Christian, they saw themselves as Jewish and followers of Jesus' particular teachings as Jews. And so they were killed and they were tortured and they were hated by everybody. Why? Why were they hated? Because they represented the poor, because they represented those who were suffering. The rich, the wealthy, the powerful, those who don't want to live by justice, who only want to have the rules that work for them, those people don't like those teachings because it calls them into account. It points them out as being a human being who, for whatever reason, is accumulating all the wealth and all the power, while other human beings who are equally important are suffering as a result, oftentimes, of this lawless person. And so that is exactly what was happening in the first century, up until this year 70. The people who were teaching these virtues of Jesus were actually upsetting the system of Rome and were upsetting the system of the Jewish people. And as a result, people did not like them. I want to point this out as a very important human reality. When we stand for what is right, when we stand for the equal justice for all people, we are going to rock the boat, and people will not like it. As you may have noticed in our current political climate, and I'm not just talking about the US where I live, I'm talking about everywhere, Britain, Russia, Switzerland, Africa, everywhere. We're struggling with the decision of how we look at our leadership. Do we expect them to follow the laws and to have the same sorts of requirements as all people? Or do we see them as different and separate and being able to be outside of those rules? So Jesus goes on to say, many are going to fall away. Many are going to betray. This word betray essentially means, it literally means coming from close beside and turning over. Essentially, somebody who you trust is going to turn you over. And that's exactly what happened in this first century. People were turning their friends in as Christians. And, in the National Socialist movement in Germany, individual Germans were turning over Jewish people to the authorities and oftentimes not knowing that they were sending them to their death. But nonetheless, that's what happens when all of this pressure from lawlessness comes down upon people. We should expect that betrayal is going to happen. False prophets is the next thing. Talks about false teachers, false prophets, and arising in this context and misleading many. Why? Why is it that false prophets do so well when lawlessness is in power? Because lawlessness is celebrated. And when lawlessness is celebrated, people will rise up and take advantage of that because they want to be part of the lawless crowd. It is far easier to live as a lawless person because it's all about being selfish. The problem is that when we do that, we neglect those people who do also need the law and who will eventually revolt violently if they cannot be heard and given justice without violence. So the next thing, Jesus points out that lawlessness is going to increase, and so the love of people is going to grow cold. Yeah, I think he nailed that. Back then, of course, that's exactly what was happening. But even today, when I look at individuals who are leaders and who seem to operate, they'll say that they're following the law, but we know that they aren't. When it comes down to it, we understand they're paying lip service to the law, just like Jesus' religious leaders back then. They're saying that they're following the law, but they don't. And that's frustrating because we have to call them out on it. And when lawless people are in power, they begin to make people sad because the world is not wonderful at that point. It's a balance, right? We can have everybody pretty darn happy on the general whole. That's a choice in a society if we want to, with law. If we remove the law, then we go back to the state of what nature's like, where a few individuals hold all the power and everybody else suffers. So all of the cash and wealth and possessions and power moves to a small select few and everybody else gets left out in the cold. That's what happens when lawlessness is given power and celebrated. And then he leaves with these two things. The first being that those who endure to the end will be saved. Endure means essentially when there is this pressure to be lawless, to join the crowd, standing up against it or standing our ground essentially for these virtues, in the end will save us. Why is that? There's really a few things, but the most important thing that I see is when people see you standing for what is right, even when lawlessness and people who are selfish seem to abound and seem to be celebrated and put in leadership, people will respect the fact that you and are standing our ground on these virtues. And when it comes time for justice to happen and for violence to take over and to right these wrongs, we will be the closest to be rescued and safe because people know that we were trying to stand for what's right. And it's about us. A lot of people think that lawlessness and living without following the rules is easier. It's not. It may look like it. There may be luxury. There may be the promise of this wonderful life. But I don't know if you've looked at individuals who are lawless, people who do flaunt the system. It is written on their faces how miserable they are and how their soul, essentially their basic human self, is dark and disturbed and angry at itself and loathing at itself and lashing out at everybody around them, even though they are in positions of power. It's not hard to see. It's written on the lines of their face. Last, Jesus notes that when in this book, it says the gospel is preached to all nations about the kingdom, the world will come to an end. That's a pretty terrible translation of this passage. I don't like the word gospel. It carries a whole lot of weird, like evangelical, and I mean this in all respect, is coming from evangelicalism myself, nonsense. Gossip, or not gossip, gospel literally means, in this translation, euangelion, and I may have mispronounced that in the Greek, essentially means this: good message, or message of the things that are good and create wellness in people or happiness in people. This message of what it means to be a good person and how to live a good life will in fact reach the nations of the world, as it has already. The internet has basically secured that right. In closing, I want to set aside for just a second all of the maybe evangelical belief system of this speaking about our end times, and remove that whole prophecy bit, and we can all make our own conclusions about that. And I welcome everybody to do the same. But setting this aside and just looking at this passage as a human being and trying to pull something from it, there is a clear message. And that is, when lawlessness is given celebration, when lawlessness is allowed to stand in leadership, it means that there will be great suffering. It means that because they are unwilling to follow the rules of giving all people and treating all people equally and protecting all people's lives and desires to follow their own belief systems, it means that they will be able to and will choose to kill individuals. It means that they'll cause people to suffer. We in the US in particular have not had to pay, haven't had to pay the price for that for a while. We fought for it early on in our, hundreds of years ago, little over 200 years ago. My family actually participated in that struggle against the king because we wanted to be able to celebrate and to live the life we wanted to, free of, a king. Today, our world is trying to figure out how to live together. And this is my final comment on this conversation. We're trying to figure out what we think is a good way to live, how to structure our societies, what we feel are the ideals of society. Because we're all closed in. Everyone around us has different worldviews, has different ways of looking at society, because we've moved into each other's countries. And so it's difficult to figure out how to live. But this message here today is important for us as humans, that we must look to creating a law of equality and holding our leaders accountable to that, and our ministers and our social influencers. We must, because when we don't, we end up allowing the celebration of this lawlessness. And eventually people will grow cold in their love and suffering will begin to grow. I appreciate so much your participation in this particular series. It's wrapped up in a lot of my own background, and I'm fascinated in this particular conversation because the end times was a big conversation and a big deal in the evangelical movement, especially recently, and it will continue to be. We're going to talk about tomorrow the abomination that causes desolation, the sort of antichrist figure that you probably have heard in pop culture, via American Dad or Family Guy. They had some great cartoons that explain that. But I love this conversation because it really does make us think about how we want to move forward as a planet, as human beings. And if you have thoughts or comments or reflections, please do include those in the comments below. I really appreciate those, and I know other people do as well. And please, I would love to have you like the Facebook page, and if you're on YouTube, there's a little button down there that says subscribe. Would love if you clicked on it so that we can stay in contact with one another. So until tomorrow, live at noon, when we see each other again, I want you to know that I love you. And I hope that you choose to love yourself. It is the only love that we have any control over in this world. And now I invite you to join me as we go about the rest of our day, loving our neighbors the same way. Thank you.